this morning to discuss the general election and its implications for Brexit. And with me is Professor Anand Menon, Director of UK and a Changing Europe. So, presumably, we've had this very clear election result. Something has changed in the Brexit process. What?
Well, we know where we're heading in the short term now, which is the first time we've been able to say this, which is that we will leave the European Union by the end of January. We're not entirely certain what happens thereafter, but there is a clarity about the Brexit process that has been absent for a couple of years.
And a lot of people have been saying, well, we're not really leaving the European Union even if we do leave. Is there any truth in that?
Not really. I mean, legally, we cease to be a member state, and that matters. I think people underestimate the psychological impact of that day when it comes, which is we will cease to be a member state, we will cease to be represented in the institutions of the European Union, flags will be lowered, either EU flags there or UK flags there. Symbolically, and I think emotionally, that will be a big deal. Thereafter, yes, we need to negotiate a relationship with the European Union, but the terms are very different at that point. We are no longer one of the 28 member states.
Now, how much of that future relationship has already been agreed, if you like, in the wording of the two agreements, and how much work is there really still to do?
Strictly speaking, the only thing that's agreed is the status of Northern Ireland, because that was taken care of inside the withdrawal agreement, which, once it's approved by both sides, as we think it will become legally binding. Everything else is up for grabs. There's a political declaration, so-called, which is a statement of intent by both sides about what they might try and get, but that is all to be negotiated, and under the terms set down in the Tory manifesto, it all has to be negotiated, signed and sealed by the end of next year.
Is the UK in a stronger position because Boris Johnson clearly has an electoral mandate?
I think the UK is a more reliable negotiating partner than it's been certainly since the election of 2017, because Boris Johnson can deliver on what he says. But I think the notion that him having a majority here makes him a stronger negotiator in Brussels is just not true. I mean, in fact, what political scientists would suggest is if you want to be strong in international negotiations, the best way to do it is to be weak at home. Because if he can go over there and say, look, my hands are tied, I haven't got much of a majority, you need to be flexible, that might work. The EU are going to look at him now, I think, and say, actually, we're constrained. We have to come to an agreement between 27 member states. So our position is quite inflexible. You, on the other hand, can do what you like. So we expect you to make some concessions.
Now, what about this commitment he's going to make in the Queen's speech tomorrow to get this done by the end of 2020? That clearly is not the way the EU historically has done business, but is it possible?
It is possible, yes. I mean, it is probably the case that only a rather thin kind of arrangement with the EU is possible in that timescale. And of course, one of the things that's happening now is that the lawyers are scratching their heads thinking, is there a way we can find to extend transition without extending transition? That is to say, to save face on both sides, but to actually maintain the status quo so we've got time to think through this relationship. Because remember, what we have to negotiate is far more than simply trade. We have a deep relationship and a broad relationship with the European Union that covers everything from foreign policy, military cooperation, cooperation on crime prevention, data sharing on criminals. All that needs to be sorted out as well.
Now, I think you've been doing a programme for Radio 4 looking at Wakefield, where you come from, where, of course, Mary Cray lost her Labour seat and the Conservatives won. Oxford, where you live now. What, in your view, is the big takeaway from the general election? Is there a fundamental change in British politics driven by where people stand on Brexit?
Well, I'd say several things. Firstly, this sort of realignment has been going on for a while. That's to say, with the benefit of 2020 from 2010 onwards, you can see that values are playing a larger role in our elections. It was heightened by the referendum because, of course, the referendum triggered that very divide on a values basis. But I think the one thing you should bear in mind is that Jeremy Corbyn was an absolutely fundamental factor in this election as well. So it's not just about that. This wasn't simply about Brexit-leaning Labour voters deciding to vote Tory. It was quite often about traditional Labour voters just thinking they couldn't vote for Jeremy Corbyn.
So what changed between 2017 and 2019?
I think a process that was started in 2017 was
about Corbyn, I mean, because he...
Well, about Corbyn specifically, I think people knew him better, and they've had two not very good years for the Labour Party, with him looking indecisive on Brexit, with him looking indecisive on anti-Semitism. I think the electorate got to know him better, and you saw that in his polling. His personal polling was dire, about as low as any leader has ever been since we've started polling on that, I think. The other thing, but it's also worth bearing in mind, the continuity between 2017 and 2019 is that it was Theresa May who started to chip away at the foundations of that red wall and made the task of Boris Johnson far easier. In a lot of those seats, you will see Labour majorities fell quite dramatically back in 2017. And actually, they didn't quite fall enough for the Tories to win, but the groundwork was laid back then.
And what's your best guess? What sort of Brexit are we now heading towards?
I mean, that's the bizarre thing, isn't it? We have to guess, because actually, despite this Brexit election, we're not entirely sure what the Prime Minister wants, whether he wants, half his party thinks he's going to go hard, half thinks he's going to go soft. I suspect the former, because I think it would be easier for him politically, but of course there will be enhanced economic impact the harder the Brexit is.
Okay, Professor Anand Menon, thank you very much indeed, from the UK in a Changing Europe think tank. Well, that's all from All Out Politics for today. Please join us again tomorrow. It's Queen's Speech Day. We've had quite a lot of those recently. Full coverage of that in the build-up, and also coming up on Sky News, reaction to Tony Blair's speech.